This is a study of the Star of Bethlehem. First, we're going to read Matthew 2. Then we're going to look briefly at a map of the Middle East and where the Magi were and where the star in the east was. Excuse me. And then we're going to look at a commentary by Constable on the whole chapter. So we have here on the screen Matthew 2. Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea. In the days of King Herod, official advisors came to Jerusalem from the east. They asked, "Where's the one born king of the Judeans? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." This disturbed not only King Herod, but all of Jerusalem as well. So he summoned all the Pharisees to determine where Christ was to be born, and they told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea." This is what the prophet wrote. "Bethlehem of Judah, you are not at all the least significant among the governors of Judah, for out of you will come a leader who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod consulted privately with the official advisors to determine the precise time when the star appeared. And he sent them into Bethlehem with these instructions: "Go and search carefully for the little one, and if you find him, tell me so that I can come and worship him." Upon hearing this from the king, they went off, and when suddenly the star they had seen in the east appeared, they went ahead of them until it came to a stop above the little one's location. They were extremely happy to see the star. Now, when they arrived at the house, they saw the little one with his mother Mary. They fell down and worshipped him, and they presented him with gifts such as gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But they were warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, so they took another route to their homeland. After they'd gone, suddenly an angel of the Master appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Wake up. Take the little one and his mother and run away to Egypt. Stay there until I talk to you again, because Herod intends to kill the child." So he woke up and took the child and his mother away that very night to Egypt, where he stayed until Herod died. This was in fulfillment of the word of the Master through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." When Herod realized that the official advisors had made him look like a fool, he was extremely furious. So he had all the children in Bethlehem killed if they were 2 years old and younger, according to the precise time he had learned from the official advisors. Then the prophecy of Jeremiah was fulfilled. A sound is heard in Ramah of wailing and deep grief. Rachel is sobbing for her children, and she cannot be consoled, for they are dead and gone. After Herod died, an angel of the Master appeared to Joseph in a dream while he was still in Egypt. He told him, "Wake up, take the little one and his mother back to the land of Israel, because those who were out to take the child's life are dead." So he woke up and took the little one and his mother to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus had succeeded his father Herod to rule in Judea, he was afraid to go there, and having been divinely warned in another dream, he went into the province of Galilee. He settled in the city of Nazareth. In fulfillment of the prophecy, he would be called a Nazarene. Now let's look at a few things, some details on that. And first of all, as I said, we're going to take a brief look at the map of the area. East is where the wise men or Magi or official advisors came from, not where the star was. They came from the east, not to the east. Now, east would take them to the capital city of Judea, which is Jerusalem, and that's where they met up with Herod. But then the star reappeared, and it went south to Bethlehem. So we can see, first of all, and we'll come back and summarize all this at the end, that this was not possibly any natural occurrence in the sky. Nothing takes a 90-degree turn like that. So they saw it while they were in the east. They saw it in their west, which was Jerusalem. And then the star moved and went south to Bethlehem. Whether it was specifically over the exact house, we don't know, but we'll look more at the details in the constable's commentary. But it's important to realize what this star did. And star, aster in Greek, simply meant any luminary in the sky, except for the sun and moon. There was the sun, the greater light, the moon, the lesser light, and the asters. Everything else was an aster. And so we don't know exactly what this was, but whatever it was, you can't calculate it with stellarium or anything else because it was a supernatural occurrence because of its motion. So just to put that to rest, now let's look at Constable's commentary. And of course, this is detailed, and we may not read over everything. But it starts out, the Old Testament not only predicted how Messiah would be born, but where he would be born. It says, he has a quotes here which are footnoted, and we won't go into all of those references, but it says that it would appear that the aim of the evangelist in recording the story of the Magi was to show that the child who was born of the lineage of David to fulfill the ideal of kingship associated with the name of Israel's greatest king was acknowledged even in his infancy and by representatives of the non-Jewish world to be par excellence the king of the Jews. This chapter gives, in a nutshell, the story of the entire Gospel of Matthew. That's chapter 2. It says, in the 708th year from the foundation of Rome, 46 BC, by Christian reckoning, Julius Caesar established the Julian calendar, beginning in the year with January 1st. So it's his fault we have a silly beginning of the year instead of in the spring where it used to be. But it was not until the 6th century AD that Dionysius Exiguus, a Scythian monk living in Rome who was confirming the Easter cycle, originated the system of reckoning time from the birth of Christ. So that's where BC and AD came from. Gradually, this usage spread, being adopted in England by the Synod of Whitby in 664 AD until it gained universal acceptance. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII reformed the Julian calendar, but more accurate knowledge shows that the earlier reckonings of the time of Christ's birth were in error by several years. It's now agreed that the birth of Christ should be placed around 6 to 4 BC. So when did the Magi visit Jesus in Bethlehem? An early tradition placed the coming of the Magi on the 6th of January or on the 13th day after his birth. Well, of course, we know that that's not probably when he was born, and so Constable goes on to say there are several factors, however, that point to a time about a year after Jesus' birth. So the Magi came a year after Jesus was born. First, Matthew described Jesus as a child, a paidion, which is where Star Wars gets the word Padawan most likely, not an infant. Second, Jesus' family was residing in a house, not beside a manger. Third, Herod's edict to destroy all the male children 2 years old and under suggests that Jesus fell within this age span. Fourth, Joseph and Mary brought the offering of poor people to the temple when they dedicated Jesus about 40 days after his birth, but after receiving the Magi's gifts, they could have presented the normal offering. So this is giving us clues about the timing. Fifth, Joseph and Mary's decision to return to Judea from Egypt implies that Judea is where they had lived before they took refuge in Egypt, so they were going back home when they went there. Matthew carefully identified the Bethlehem of Judea in contrast to the Bethlehem in Zebulun as the birthplace of Jesus. This was important because the prophecy of Messiah's birthplace was specifically Bethlehem of Judah, the hometown of King David. And Judah and Judea are pretty much the same thing. Herod the Great, as he is now called, was born in 73 BC and was named king of Judea by the Roman Senate in 40 BC. By 37 BC, he had crushed with the help of Roman forces all opposition to his rule. He was the son of the Idumean Antipater. He was wealthy, politically gifted, loyal, administrator, clever enough to remain in the good graces of successive Roman emperors. His famine relief was superb. Building projects, including the temple, began 20 BC, were admired even by his enemies, but he loved power. He inflicted heavy taxes on people and resented the fact that many Jews considered him a usurper. In his last years, he suffered an illness that compounded his paranoia, and he turned to cruelty, and in fits of rage and jealousy killed many close associates, including his wife of Jewish descent from the Maccabeans and at least 2 of his own sons. So the guy was a nutcase, but a gifted one. Some argued the date for Herod's reign are 31 to 1 BC, placing the birth of Jesus in late 3 BC or early 2 BC. Herod was not only an Idumean in race and a Jew in religion, but he was a heathen in practice and a monster in character. The Jews had borne more calamities from Herod in a few years than had their forefathers during all that interval of time that passed since they had come out of Babylon and returned home. So he was a nasty guy, a talented, nasty guy. And just to give their main focus here is to give more of an idea of when he was ruling in the area. Behold, the word in Greek is idu, is a Hebraic expression that Matthew used to point out the the wise men, they are the focus of his attention. So when he says behold, he's saying pay attention to this. It's not easy to identify the Magi from the Greek word magoi. Precisely, the Greek word from which we get that word comes from a Persian word that means experts regarding the stars, or astrologers. Centuries before Christ's time, they were a priestly caste of Chaldeans who could interpret dreams. Later, the term broadened to include men interested in dreams, magic, astrology, and the future. Some of these were honest inquirers after the truth, but others were charlatans. The Magi who came to Jerusalem came from the east. Jerusalem at this time covered about 300 acres, and the population might have been 200 to 250,000 people. So they probably came from Babylon, which had been a center for the study of the stars. Babylon had also been the home of Daniel, the prophet, who had been in command of former Magi in Babylonia, according to Daniel 2:48, and who had written of the death of Messiah in Daniel 9:24-27, the coming one being cut off. The oldest opinion is that the Magi came from Arabia rather than Persia. Magi had such a dubious reputation in Jewish and Christian circles that it's unlikely that Matthew would have mentioned their testimony if it were not true. And so they go on about talking about Magi and astrologers, but what made them wise men or that they inquired after Christ. The Magi's question was not, where is he who had been born to become king of the Jews, but where is he who has been born king of the Jews? Jesus' status as Israel's king did not come to him later in his life. He was born with it. In this respect, he was superior to Herod, who was not born a king and saw the young child as a threat to his throne. The only other occurrences of the title of king of the Jews in Matthew are in 27:11, 29, and 37, where Gentiles use these words to mock Jesus. What Jesus' star was remains problematic. Some scholars have suggested a conjunction of the planets Jupiter and Saturn in the constellation of Pisces. Others believed it was a supernova, a comet, a luminous meteor, or some other planetary conjunctions or groupings. Still others believed it was a supernatural creation. And so that he doesn't know, he doesn't take a position because he says whatever it was. But again, its motion tells us that it was absolutely supernatural. It was not a conjunction of anything. And remember that the word planet is from the word wanderer in Greek, planetes. And when it's combined with the word aster, it means a star that wanders. That is to say, a star that is not in a fixed constellation. And that's all planets were to anybody in ancient times. But when it came to just the word aster, and other things moved in the sky, obviously, such as what has commonly been called falling stars, whatever they were in the sky that were bright, they were asters. Anyway, it was the same star, whatever they saw while they were in the east, that guided them to Jesus' home in Bethlehem, or at least to the city of Bethlehem. The presence of the definite Greek article with star, that means the star, in verse 9, points to the same star mentioned in verse 2. It seems to me that it would be very unlikely that a planetary conjunction or other natural star could have given the wise men such specific guidance. So we know what the star wasn't. And so all the reams of paper that have been printed or written about in some way, videos done about stellarium or planetary conjunctions or anything like that, are all a waste of time. It's not worth studying them because A, it's speculation, and B, it doesn't pay any attention to what's obviously in the text here, which is that the star was seen by people in the east and then it moved south. Asters, things in the sky, don't move that way. They don't go north-south. They go east-west. So, how did they know about it? Perhaps the Magi connected Balaam's messianic prophecy of a star that would rise out of Judah from Numbers 24:17 with the Jewish king. Balaam evidently originated in the east. The Jews in Jesus' day regarded Balaam's oracle as messianic, that is to say, about Jesus. Interestingly, Balaam, like the wise men, experienced pressure from a king who was intent on destroying God's people, but he and they refused to cooperate. Another explanation is when the Magi said, "We saw his star," they meant that they had seen a sign that he had been born or was soon to be born. The Magi's statement that they intended to worship the new king does not necessarily mean that they regarded him as divine. They may have meant that they wanted to pay him their respects. However, in view of chapter 1, we know that the new king was worthy of true worship. This word occurs 13 times in Matthew and is something that the writer stressed. Apparently, the Magi recognized the king as Israel's Messiah. Whether they thought he was divine or not, they knew he was the king of the Jews. Because king of the Jews was a Gentile expression for Messiah. The Messiah was indeed king of the Jews. This news troubled Herod. Why? Because he was very aware of the Jews' desire to throw off the Roman yoke and his own rule in particular. Remember Pharaoh's fear for his throne that also led to infanticide. Herod was an Edomite, a descendant of Esau, and the prospect of a Jewish Messiah's appearance was one that he could not ignore. The rest of Jerusalem's citizens also became disturbed because they realized that this news from the Magi might lead to Herod to take further cruel action against them. That's why they were upset. And this is what happened. Already we begin to see the opposition of the people of Jerusalem to Jesus that would eventually result in his crucifixion. So people don't just suddenly turn on someone. There are things that lead up to it, which is why when we study prophecy, we look for things that lead up to what we can point to definitively. The world is ruled not by truth but by opinion is a phrase they have here because of what was just said about Jerusalem and Herod. They didn't care what was true. They cared about their own safety. Herod assembled Israel's leaders to investigate the Magi's announcement. The chief priests were mainly Sadducees at this time, and were most of the scribes were Pharisees, and were most of the scribes. So the Pharisees were an ecclesiastical party, a religious political group, held together by their peculiar aims and views, whereas the scribes were a body of experts in the scholastic sense. Certainly a man might be both a Pharisee and a scribe, and the fact is that practically all the scribes were Pharisees in outlook and association, hence their being so often mentioned along with the Pharisees, yet the two fraternities were different from each other, and of course we know that the Sadducees did not believe in the supernatural, so that's a huge difference. The chief priests included the high priest and his associates. The high priest obtained his position by appointment from Rome at this time in Israel's history. The scribes were the official interpreters and communicators of the Mosaic law to the people. In other words, they're lawyers. Since the two groups of leaders did not get along, Herod may have had meetings with each group separately. So when it says he met privately, there were probably a lot of reasons for that. So I'm going to skip down here a little bit. But it does mention some terms that I do want to go over after all. The scribe's duty was to make copies of the scriptures and classify and teach the precepts of the oral law and to keep account of every letter in the Old Testament writings. So this is where you get the idea of how accurate the Bible is copied, but you have to understand when people make that argument, they're talking mostly about the Masoretic text, and the Masoretes were a later term for these scribes who were also called Talmudists and Kabbalists, and we're going to look at all of those terms here. It says such an office was necessary in a religion of law and precept because they were lawyers, not because they were so faithful, and it was an Old Testament function. To this legitimate work, the scribes added a record of rabbinical decisions, that is to say, judicial decisions on questions of ritual. The new code resulting from those decisions were called the Mishnah. Okay, so these are rulings, these are judges' decisions or precedents, as they might use in constitutional law here in the U.S. The Hebrew sacred legends were the Gemara, forming with the Mishnah, the Talmud. Commentaries on the Old Testament, the Midrashim, reasonings upon these, the Haggadah, and finally mystical interpretations which found in Scripture meanings other than the grammatical, lexical, and obvious ones, and this was the Kabbalah. So the Kabbalah is the mystical Judaism, oral tradition, not Scripture. And it was not unlike, they say here, the allegorical method of Origen. So when somebody quotes Origen, a quote-unquote church father, he was an allegorist. We need to keep that in mind. In our Lord's time, the Pharisees considered it orthodox to receive this massive writing, which had been superimposed upon and had obscured the Scriptures. These were the traditions that Jesus had a problem with. It doesn't mean all tradition is bad. It means these traditions of the Pharisees and Sadducees and scribes was the bad part. The Jews of Jesus' day regarded the halakha, the rule of the spiritual road, as having greater authority than the Hebrew scriptures. And there are people today who want to do the same thing, such as science textbooks. They make the Bible about science. Josephus wrote the following about the influence of the Pharisees. They were, during the intertestamental period, they were the worst disposed to him, this someone named John Hyrcanus, were the Pharisees, who are one of the sects of the Jews, as we have informed you already. These have so great power over the multitude that when they say anything against the king or against the high priest, they are presently believed. That's why they could persuade the crowd to shout for Jesus' crucifixion. Notice that Herod called the king whom the Magi had spoken of the Messiah. Some of the Jews, particularly the Essenes, whom Herod did not consult, but not the Sadducees and Pharisees, were expecting a Messiah to appear soon, because of Daniel 9:24-27. Daniel had been a wise man in the East also. So this is likely where they found out about the Star of the East. The star in the East, where they were, not a star that would be seen in the East from them, which it had been looking the opposite way. Matthew adroitly answers Jewish unbelief concerning Jesus Christ by quoting their own official body to the effect that the prophecy of his birth in Bethlehem was literal, that the Messiah was to be an individual, not the entire Jewish nation, and that their Messiah was to be a king who would rule over them. So Matthew is combating Gnostic, Kabbalistic, Talmudic impositions on the scripture. In the original context of Micah 5:2 in the Old Testament, the prophet is speaking prophetically and prophesying that whenever the Messiah is born, he will be born in Bethlehem of Judah. That's the literal, not allegorical, meaning of Micah 5:2. When a literal prophecy is fulfilled in the New Testament, it is quoted as a literal fulfillment. Many prophecies fall into this category. So in many cases, we have in the New Testament a confirmation of literal prophecies in the Old Testament. And from that, we can get the idea that we can't allegorize everything in the Bible. The Bible itself says that that's wrong by this example. Another writer called this literal prophecy plus literal fulfillment. Still another called the fulfillment direct fulfillment. Whatever these terms is not really that important. Matthew's rendering of Micah 5:2 prophecy adds the fact that the ruler would shepherd the Israelites. This statement from 2 Samuel 5:2 originally referred to David. Thus, Matthew again showed the connection between the prophecies of Messiah and the Davidic line, a connection that he also made in chapter 1. Perhaps the religious leaders put these passages together in their quotation, because when you look for exact quotations, you frequently don't find them, not because they're sloppy, but because of the Hebrew habits of, and the New Testament writers' habits of putting things together that weren't put together before, and also that they're quoting from the Greek Septuagint a lot of times and not the Hebrew Masoretic text, which didn't exist yet till after the time of Christ, till after the 1st century. And from the dispersion in Babylon before the time of Christ is when the Septuagint came into frequent use. The quotation is free, not verbatim, from either the Hebrew or the Greek Septuagint text, so it's a paraphrase and a combination. So let's skip a little bit of that detail, and we'll go down here to covering verses 7 and 8. Evidently Herod summoned the Magi secretly in order to avoid arousing undue interest in their visit among Israel's religious leaders. He didn't want anybody to get too excited about this or know too much about it, or they might join this king in toppling him. He wanted to know when the star appeared so he could determine the age of the child. So he was obviously lying to the Magi when he said, I want to go worship him. He wanted to go kill him. So under a pretext of desire to worship the new king, Herod sent the Magi to Bethlehem as his representatives with orders to report what they found to him. His hypocritical humility deceived the wise men. He must have sensed this, since he sent no escort with them, but trusted them to return to him. So he believed and actually did fool them, and so he wasn't worried about making sure they reported back. It's remarkable that the chief priests and scribes apparently made no effort to check out Jesus' birth like the Magi did, these Gentiles from the East. It's strange how much the scribes knew and what little use they made of it. As reminds us of 1 Corinthians 13, which says, I could have all knowledge, but without love, it's nothing. It's a noisy symbol. Their apathy contrasts with the Magi's curiosity and Herod's fear. It continued into Jesus' ministry until it turned into antagonism. So this is the seed of the plots against Jesus. They say under verses 9 through 12, here Constable says, perhaps the star, whatever it was so bright that the wise men could see it as they traveled in daylight. Travel at night was common to avoid the heat, so they may have made the 5-mile trip south to Bethlehem at night. Nevertheless, this would have been winter, so they probably traveled during daylight hours. So we didn't know what time of day it was, but they could see the star. The star may have identified Bethlehem as the town, and the Magi may have obtained his exact location from the residents. On the other hand, the star may have identified the very house. This seems more likely in view of verse 11. So it came right over the house where they were living. Notice the wise men came to a house, not a manger, as many Christmas cards picture them doing. God supernaturally guided the seekers. That's the key to anyone seeking, is if you demand that God shows himself to you, he doesn't answer our demands. You have to seek him out genuinely. So they found the Messiah. God's provision gave them great joy. The reaction of the wise men to discovering the child and his mother was to bow and worship him only. Notice they did not worship Mary, nor did they worship Jesus through Mary. It's customary in the ancient Near East to present gifts when approaching a superior. The wise men produced these from their treasures or coffers, and this was, of course, a caravan of wise men, not just 3 people. You don't make journeys like that with so few. You got to defend yourself. And they had treasures with them to be defended as well. There were robbers. Anyway, they were rich. The expensive gifts reflected the great honor the Magi bestowed upon the Christ child. The gold probably financed Joseph and Mary's trip to Egypt. Frankincense is a gum obtained from the resin of certain trees that was particularly fragrant. Myrrh was also a sap-like substance that came from a tree that grew in Arabia. People used it as a spice, as a perfume, often for embalming, as well as for other applications, and many make a point of saying that this was a prefiguring of his death, eventually. Many commentators, ancient and modern, have seen symbolic significance in these. So we'll skip past that a little bit. God supernaturally intervened to keep the Magi from returning to Herod, who would have then been able, from what they told him, to target Jesus precisely. Dreams were a common method of divine guidance during the Old Testament economy in which Jesus lived. So, several contrasts in this section reveal Matthew's emphases. Herod, the wicked Idumean usurper king, contrasts with Jesus, the born righteous king of Israel. The great distance from which the Magi traveled to visit Jesus contrasts with the short distance Israel's leaders would have had to travel in order to see him. The genuine worship of the wise men contrasts with the pretended worship of Herod and the total lack of worship from the chief priests and scribes. The Gentile Magi's sensitivity and responsiveness to divine guidance also contrasts with the insensitivity and unresponsiveness of Israel's leaders. So the first to worship Jesus were Gentiles. The supernatural stellar manifestations attest the divine character of the person of Jesus. I mean, all of these things put together. Then it says, Matthew notes the fact that the Magi who worship the Messiah of Israel are forced to take refuge from Bethlehem. This too is a hint of the future antagonism of Israel to their king. He contrasts the eagerness of the Magi to worship Jesus, despite their limited knowledge, with the apathy of Jewish leaders. How true is that of many religious leaders today? The kingdom was not ready for the king, so a reception for him was not arranged and organized by those who should have been waiting for him. As Jesus said when he grew up, he rebuked people for not knowing the time of their visitation from the prophets and not telling the people about it. There were only a few who knew, such as the prophet and the 2 prophets, a male and female prophet in the temple when Jesus was dedicated, who said, the man said, God told me I wouldn't die until I saw his anointed one, and he was very old. And the lady was also very old and made prophecies about Jesus as well. So they were the only ones who greeted him as king. And then there are prophecies about Egypt, which we could go into, which you can read in the link here that'll be in the description. And the point is that we're looking at how, why, when, and where, and so forth. So I'm going to skip down here to the commentary on verses 14, 15. Herod died in 4 BC. Josephus recorded that he died a horrible death, his body rotting away and consumed by worms. He was buried in the Herodium, one of the palace fortresses that he had constructed not far from Bethlehem. His grandson, Herod Agrippa, later suffered a similar fate in Acts 12:23. As noted, Matthew frequently used the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies to show that Jesus was the Christ, and verse 15 is another fulfillment. But then they talk about some difficulties with the text. But Matthew did not claim that Jesus was fulfilling a prophecy. And fulfill has a broad meaning more than just to make complete. It means to establish completely, that is to say, to verify. In the case of predictive prophecy, the complete establishment of what the prophet predicted occurred when the event that was predicted happened. Anyway, so we're skipping some parts that you can read later that don't have to do with the point of our study here today, about typologies and things like that. So we'll skip down here to verse 16 to 18. Some critical scholars discounted Matthew's account of Herod's slaughter of the Bethlehem children because there's no extra biblical confirmation, which they say about a lot of things, but there are still quite a lot that are confirmed. However, Bethlehem was small. It was a tiny little crossroads town, and many other biblical significant events have no secular confirmation, including Jesus' crucifixion. Some writers estimated that this purge would have affected only about 15 or 20 children that Herod killed. He believed that the total population of Bethlehem at this time was under 1,000. Compared to some of Herod's other atrocities, this one was minor. So why would anybody outside of the area write about what happens in a small town? So this is I'm just going to read this quote about Herod. Emperor Augustus reportedly said it was better to be Herod's sow than his son, for his sow had a better chance of surviving in a Jewish community. In the Greek language, as in English, there's only one letter difference between the two words. The selfsame character traits Herod exhibits in chapter 2, the religious leaders will exhibit later in the story. To enumerate the most obvious of these, Herod shows himself to be spiritually blind, fearful, conspiratorial, guileful, and mendacious, murderous, wrathful, and apprehensive of the future. So they became like the person they hated who was ruling over them. Here's a terrible illustration of what men will do to get rid of Jesus Christ. If a man is set on his own way, and I'm hoping they're using the word generically, which is unfortunate in this day and time, if he sees in Christ someone who is liable to interfere with his ambitions and rebuke his ways, then his one desire is to eliminate Christ, and then he is driven to the most terrible things. For then, if he does not break men's bodies, he will break their hearts. And this is what's coming in prophecy as well against Christians. Christians will be blamed for everything. And after the disappearance in the rapture, anyone who puts their faith in Jesus because of that event, after that event, will be hunted down and killed. But the problem here is also describing what it is that people do when they're confronted with the gospel. They don't want God to interfere with their life the way they're living it, and therefore they don't want to hear anything about Jesus because it makes them uncomfortable, and they think, oh no, I'm going to have to give up such and such if I become a Christian, and I'd rather not do that. I'll wait till I don't care about that anymore later in my life, which may or may not come. We never know. But it says here, we must look upon this murder of the infants under another character. It was their martyrdom. They shed their blood for him who afterwards sheds his for them. These were the infantry of the noble army of martyrs. I never thought to look at it in that way, but it's a valid perspective that they were sacrificed for him. And I can assure you that babies go to heaven. I don't care what the Calvinists say. Innocents go to heaven, and they're innocent until they're old enough to truly choose or reject God. So, quoting of Jeremiah, we'll skip over that for now, about the Babylonian captivity, etc. And go down to verses 19 to 20. Herod the Great died in 4 BC, and there is some disputing over those years. There's range of years is about as well as you can pin it down. But according to Constable, he seems to be set on 4 BC. Josephus wrote of his condition shortly before his death as followed, and that goes into detail about how awful it was the way he died. God's sovereign initiative is again the subject of Matthew's record. This is the 4th dream and the 3rd mention of the angel of the Lord appearing to Joseph in a prologue, that is to say, the husband of Mary. The phrase "the land of Israel" occurs only here in the New Testament. Evidently, Matthew used it because he recalls the promises and blessings that God gave Jacob and his descendants. So anyway, when it comes to when the star appeared, we know that it was about a year later that the Magi arrived in Israel. The year being that the fact is that they arrived when Jesus was probably at least a year old, but something under 2, because Herod asked for specifics about when the star was seen, and the Magi came to a house, not a manger, as was already gone over in Constable's notes. So if we're to summarize all of this about the Star of Bethlehem, first of all, the Magi, the official advisors, the diviners, the astrologers, there was more than 3. They were rich, and they likely learned about the star from the influence of the prophet Daniel long before then. God warned them in a dream not to tell Herod where the child was and to get out of there. So he even cares about these Gentiles because, after all, they were the only ones who honored Jesus at his birth. And we know that since Herod killed the boys under 2 to try to destroy his imagined rival to the throne, that we have a limit on how old Jesus could have been, but he wasn't an infant. So somewhere between infancy and 2 years old is when the Magi came and when the star was seen. We've already explained about what an aster is, any celestial body, that they move east to west, and this one moved south from Jerusalem to Bethlehem after the Magi asked Herod's court about the King of the Jews' star. It's unlikely that the aster was natural because it went south, and it may have been the glory of God that Israel saw as they were leaving Egypt, but who knows? And it doesn't even matter, because a desire to make it natural is a desire to make the scriptures bow to science. Was Gentiles from the East who actually paid attention to Daniel the prophet, whereas the religious and secular leaders in Israel knew the words, knew what the prophecy was, but didn't care, didn't even check it out. And this happened a few years BC. But again, people get obsessed with pinning down the year because they want to know about how they can match this up with star software like Stellarium, which is pointless. More importantly is when Jesus was appeared and was killed. Exactly the year he was killed was more important because it fulfills Daniel's prophecy. But in terms of the year we think that's another issue. And again, I don't think it's possible to be any more precise than a few years BC. Probably 3 or 4 BC, somewhere in there. And Jesus was about 30 when he began his public ministry. How long was that ministry? Anywhere from 1 to 3.5 years. I think probably 2. And I don't give it a half because there was a Passover near when he was baptized by John the Baptist. And then he was also crucified and rose again at a Passover. So there's no room for a half year. Other than that, there's no point or possibility of being more accurate about when this star appeared. So hopefully that will answer questions about the Star of Bethlehem. Again, there's no point in calculations or anything like that. The point is that Gentiles, probably in Babylon, paid attention to historical writings especially of Daniel, and cared enough to make a journey across the land to a land that wasn't theirs to see a king and honor him. They prepared in advance to honor, which his own people couldn't have cared less about, which is, again, how the life of Joseph in the Old Testament was a type and shadow of Jesus, because he too was rejected by his brothers who hated him for his dreams and who wound up saving them all. So that's all I have to say about this. Hopefully next time I make a recording, I'll pay more attention to what's going on in my recording software. And thanks for listening.